Welcome back to Mythic Slumber. Tonight, we follow a flicker of gold in ancient Egypt, where the Nile drifts through a land of temples and tombs, and in a hidden valley lies a small chamber that once held a boy king, Tutankhamun, whose brief life passed like lamplight, whose reign ended too soon in hurried burial, treasures stacked by men working against time before they sealed the door and walked away into desert silence. Picture this. You are standing at the sealed doorway of his tomb, cool limestone beneath your palm, the weight of 3,000 years pressing against the stone. The air is thick with ancient resins and gold that has never seen sunlight. Tonight, we'll walk gently through that doorway into his world, his death, and the secrets that waited in darkness. And if this journey helps your mind rest, you're welcome to like and subscribe so these soft histories are waiting for you. Before Tutankhamun ever opened his eyes to the light of Egypt, his world had already been built for centuries. Picture the Nile at dusk, its surface darkening to deep blue as the sun slides down behind the western cliffs, and on the eastern bank the city of Thebes glows with hundreds of oil lamps while the western mountains rise like a sleeping lion, hiding secret tombs deep inside their stone. You can feel the weight of all those generations pressing down through the rock, through the sand, through the very air. A kingdom so certain of its own strength that it carved its confidence into every temple wall, every golden statue, every whispered prayer. Great pharaohs have already walked this land, their names flowing into the stone like water into cracks. Thutmose, who pushed the borders outward, Hatshepsut, who built temples that kissed the sky, Amenhotep, who filled the treasury until it gleamed. Their armies have marched to distant horizons and returned with rivers of gold from Nubia, cedar logs from Lebanese mountains that smell of resin and rain, lapis lazuli the colour of midnight, copper that catches firelight, and incense that rises in pale ribbons toward the gods. The pharaoh stands at the centre of it all, the living thread between heaven and earth, wearing the double crown that binds Upper and Lower Egypt into one body, one breath, one eternal now, his image repeated in stone so many times that even the walls seem to breathe his name. At Karnak, the temple of Amun rises like a stone forest. Massive columns tower over the worshippers, carved with hieroglyphs and scenes of the king offering incense and wine to the gods. Sunlight filters down in soft beams, catching particles of dust and incense smoke. In the courtyards, priests in white linen move with practiced steps, carrying offerings, chanting hymns that have already been old for centuries. Trumpets sound, drums beat. The god statue is carried in a sacred boat during festivals, its presence hidden behind golden doors, its power felt in the trembling of the crowd. In Luxor, a little further south, another temple gleams with painted reliefs and tall obelisks. On festival days, the statue of Amun sails down the Nile from Karnak in a gilded bark, accompanied by priests and musicians. People line the river banks to watch, lifting their hands in prayer. They live in mud brick houses, work in the fields, grind grain, bake bread, and raise children. Their eyes sometimes lift toward the temples and palaces, knowing that above their daily lives, the machinery of the state moves like a great, slow chariot. Behind the temples and palaces stands an invisible power, the priesthood. Over generations, especially in Thebes, the priests of Amun have grown rich and influential. The god's estates cover vast tracts of land. His temples own herds of cattle, vineyards, workshops, and fleets of boats. The scribes who work for Amun record harvests, taxes and offerings with careful strokes of reed pens. In a way, Egypt has two great powers now. The pharaoh on his throne and the god Amun with his priests. For a while, this balance holds. The king builds temples for Amun, and Amun's priests bless the king. Far from the cities, on the western bank across from Thebes, there is another kind of sacred place, the Valley of the Kings. Here, hidden among bare hills and narrow ravines, are the tombs of the pharaohs. Each tomb is cut deep into the rock, its corridors and chambers painted with scenes of the sun's nightly journey through the underworld. In these images, the king sails with Ra in a solar boat, meets gods with animal heads, passes through dangerous gates, and finally is reborn at dawn. The tombs are meant to be safe, secret, and eternal. Once a king is laid to rest, the entrance is sealed, the path disguised, the cliff face left to blend back into silence. In this age, the royal architects and craftsmen are busy. When a new pharaoh takes the throne, they begin his tomb at once. It takes years, even decades, to plan, carve, smooth, and decorate the chambers. Carvers chip away at the limestone by torchlight, their hammers echoing underground. Painters follow, covering the walls with deep blue, bright yellow, red, green, and black, filling them with hieroglyphs and protective spells. Coffins are carved and gilded, jewellery is made, stone sarcophagi are shaped and smoothed. All this must be ready before the king dies, so that his passage into the afterlife is perfect. On the surface, Egypt looks calm and immovable. The Nile still rises each year, flooding the fields with dark, rich silt. Farmers still plant barley and emmer, still harvest with sickles, still offer the first cut to the gods in thanks. Craftsmen in workshops near the palace carve furniture, inlay boxes, and polish amulets in the shapes of scarabs, eyes, and ankhs. Scribes train young boys to draw the shapes of words line after line, until the signs become part of their hands. In Memphis and Thebes, officials keep careful records of taxes, deliveries, and decrees. Everything is measured, counted, weighed, and recorded, as if writing itself will keep chaos at bay. But under that smooth surface, tension has begun to grow. The pharaohs are still mighty, but they must now share some of their authority with the powerful temple institutions. When the priests of Amun can mobilize wealth, an influence comparable to the crown, questions arise, even if they are rarely spoken aloud. Who truly speaks for the gods? Where does loyalty lie when the throne and the temple disagree? It is a quiet unease, like the first faint crack in a statue that still seems whole. In the royal palace, another kind of pressure exists. The line of succession must be secure. The king needs sons to inherit the throne, daughters to marry into alliances, and a stable household to project the image of divine order. Behind closed doors, queens, secondary wives, and royal children move through painted halls. There, lives woven into the fabric of politics, ritual, and personal ambition. When a king grows older, courtiers and generals begin to think of what comes next. When he dies, there must be no hesitation, no vacuum. The next pharaoh must step forward with certainty, and the machinery of power must not falter. It is into this grand, glittering, slightly strained world that Tutankhamun will one day be born. A world of stone and song, of ordered ritual and hidden worries. A world where the temples are rich, the Valley of the Kings is already lined with royal tombs, and everyone believes that Egypt, with its gods and its pharaohs, will endure forever. No one yet knows that a single, radical king will soon try to rewrite the map of heaven, or that a boy king will later be asked to mend that break. For now, the Nile flows steadily. The stars turn slowly overhead. The golden mask of death is still just an idea in the minds of craftsmen, and somewhere, just beyond the horizon of time, a small tomb waits in the rock, not yet carved, quietly expecting its unexpected owner. As we prepare to step into a moment of great change, let your body become heavy and still. If you are enjoying this deep quiet, please leave a gentle like. Your support helps other weary souls find this calm path to sleep. The calm world of temples and many gods stretched on for generations, unchanging as the Nile's rhythm, until from within that golden certainty a single figure rose who would tilt everything sideways and leave behind a crack that never fully closed. He began as Amenhotep IV, son of Amenhotep III, heir to a long and splendid line, and at first nothing about him whispered of revolution. He inherited a rich kingdom, where the priesthood held power woven into every corner of Egyptian life, where rituals had been repeated for so long they felt like the heartbeat of the world itself. Yet somewhere in his mind, or in his heart, a different vision had taken root, quiet at first, like a seed splitting open beneath sand. In the early years of the king's reign, a subtle shift occurred as he began to favour the sun god's aspect, the Aten, the glowing disk. Though the Aten was a previously existing divine form, it was elevated above all others. Hymns excluded other names, and relief showed the sun disk's rays ending in hands bestowing life symbols upon the royal family. Initially, this seemed like mere enthusiasm, but the king's devotion grew exclusive and sharp. Over time, other gods' names vanished from inscriptions. Amun, the great god of Thebes, had his name and images chiselled out of walls. Centuries-old temples were shut, their funds redirected to new shrines for the Aten. Amenhotep IV no longer fit his own name. He changed it, as if changing his skin. He became Akhenaten, effective for the Aten, and with that new name, he stepped more fully into his role as prophet and servant of the sun disk. The heart of Egypt's religious life began to tilt. At Thebes, where Amun's priests had long held sway, the atmosphere must have grown tense. Their god, once supreme, was being pushed aside. Their estates, their offerings, their political influence were suddenly precarious. Official art and ritual turned to face the Aten. Processions that once honoured many gods now thinned. The old festival calendar frayed. Inside the great hyperstyle halls, dust began to settle where crowds had once gathered. Akhenaten chose not to wrestle endlessly with Thebes. He chose to leave it. On a stretch of virgin desert, roughly halfway between Memphis in the north and Thebes in the south, he marked out a new city, a place with no old temples, no shrines to rival gods, no inherited priesthoods. Boundary stelae were carved into the rocky cliffs, recording his devotion to the Aten and his promise that this place, Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, would be the sun god's special home. Soon, the desert boiled with activity. Work gangs cut stone, laid foundations, raised temple courts open to the sky. Palaces took shape, white walls reflecting the light. Residences for nobles and administrators spread out in neat lines. Workshops appeared for sculptors, painters, potters, and scribes. The city grew astonishingly fast, like a plant in flood season, fed by the king's will and the state's resources. Life in Akhetaten was different from life in Thebes. The main temples had no dark inner sanctuaries for a hidden god statue. Instead, they were open-air courts, full of sunlight, with offering tables set under the Aten's rays. The royal family was everywhere in the art, shown in intimate domestic scenes, cradling daughters, sitting together beneath the sun disk, performing rituals as the primary intermediaries between God and people. The style of carving shifted too. Figures became more fluid, more elongated. Bellies swelled, faces lengthened. There was a new softness, even a conscious strangeness, in how bodies were portrayed. For some, this new world must have felt exhilarating. Artists had more freedom. The king's favour could elevate a family quickly in the fresh bureaucracy of a brand new city. Young officials might have seen Akhenaten as a place of opportunity, a clean slate, a horizon without shadows. For others, it must have been deeply unsettling. Old certainties faded. Families who had served the temples of Amun for generations saw their roles vanish. Villagers in other parts of Egypt, far from the new capital, still baked bread and prayed as they always had, but now there was a sense that the king himself did not approve of the gods they loved. And somewhere within this brilliant, unstable experiment, a small boy lived and watched. His name, when we first meet him in history, carries the mark of this revolution. Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten. He was likely born during or just after the height of Akhenaten's religious reforms. Perhaps his earliest memories were of Akhenaten's wide avenues, its blinding light, its walls painted with scenes of the royal family and the Aten above them. He would have known the feeling of stepping into open courtyards where priests raised offerings directly under the sky, not in shadowed halls. He might have listened at a distance as his father, or another high-ranking figure, chanted the great hymn to the Aten, that long lyrical praise of the single sun god as creator of all lands and all peoples. In the royal residence, Tutankhaten would have grown up among siblings and half-siblings, nurses and tutors, guards and scribes. The language around him, the prayers, the official stories, all pointed to the Aten. Images of Amun, Mut, Khonsu, Ptah, Hathor and countless others were absent or deliberately obscured. Where once a royal child might have had small figurines of many gods, he likely saw fewer, and those he did see were tied closely to the new cult. And yet, even inside this bright bubble, the wider world did not disappear. Letters arrived from foreign rulers carved into clay tablets in foreign scripts. They came from Hatti, from Mitanni, from city-states in Canaan and Syria. Some of them praised the pharaoh and offered gifts. Others complained. They spoke of local wars, of enemies on the march, of troops and gold that were promised but did not come. The king's attention seemed fixed on heaven, but the earth was shifting under his feet. We do not know how much of this Tutankhaten understood as a child, but he would have felt the undercurrent of worry among adults. Servants and officials spoke more quietly. Envoys from abroad looked anxious or resentful or pleading. Even within the royal family losses occurred. Some of Akhenaten's daughters died young. Nefertiti, so prominent in the early years, may have lost status or shifted roles. Ancient sources are fragmentary and mysterious. Toward the end of Akhenaten's reign, gaps open in the record. Co-regent may have appeared, Smenkhkare, and then vanished. Nefertiti herself may have taken on new names and functions. The neat picture of a king, his queen, and their daughters standing beneath the Aten's rays becomes fractured, full of contested interpretations. What we can say with some confidence is that by the time Tutankhaten approached the age where a prince's future is weighed, the Aten experiment was under enormous strain. The economy had been twisted by the redirection of temple wealth. Traditional elites in Thebes and elsewhere had been pushed aside and quietly nursed their grievances. Foreign allies felt neglected. The old order was damaged but not fully erased. It waited, like seeds under dry soil, for the first rain of opportunity. Tutankhaten's world, in other words, was already collapsing when he came into focus. He would have seen building projects slow, then stop. He would have heard fewer hymns in the courtyards and more worried conversations inside rooms. The city of Akhenaten, so quickly raised, began to hold a strange stillness in some quarters. Finished facades over rooms that were never fully used, shrines that never quite gathered the devotion they were built to receive. Then, suddenly, the axis shifted again. Akhenaten died. Whether by illness, age, or some other cause, the man whose will had shaped an entire capital and a new religious vision was gone. The Aten still shone in the sky, but its chief interpreter on earth was silent. The layers of authority beneath him scrambled to find a new balance. Brief, shadowy reigns flickered. In that swirl, a decision was made that would change the course of the boy's life and of Egypt itself. Tutankhaten would become king, but if he was to sit upon the throne of Egypt, it could not be as the child of a failed revolution in a half-empty desert capital. To restore stability, to heal the damage done to the old gods and their institutions, something had to give. First, the city would be abandoned. Then, the boy's very name would be changed. The world of the Aten, with its open-air courts and radical hymns, began to fade behind him like a dream at dawn. Ahead lay Thebes, the temples of Amun, the Valley of the Kings, and a path from Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, the boy who would be asked to mend what had been broken long before he could truly understand it. For now, though, we leave him standing on the threshold between two universes, one with a single glaring sun, and one with a crowded ancient sky of gods, waiting to be let back in. Allow your breath to settle, slow and steady, like the deep rhythm of the distant Nile. If you feel yourself drifting, you can help us preserve this sanctuary by subscribing. Rest now, we're nearly in the king's quiet chamber. When we step into Tutankhamun's childhood, we must call him by a different name. Before he became Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, he was Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, a boy named for the blazing sun disk that his father worshipped above all other gods. Imagine the city of Akhenaten from his perspective. You're very small. The stone thresholds are high, the courtyards enormous, the columns painted with bright flowers that seem taller than any tree. Everywhere, the sunlight is strong. It spills over white plaster walls and floods the open-air temples where people bring offerings not into dark inner chambers, but directly beneath the naked sky. Each morning, the palace wakes with the rising sun. Servants move quietly through shadowed corridors, sweeping dust from the floors, lighting incense, laying out linen clothing freshly laundered and smoothed. In the nurseries and private rooms, nurses lift sleepy children, wash their faces, smooth their hair, and wrap them in fine garments. A young boy, Tutankhaten, is among them. He's not the only child of the royal house. There are princesses, daughters of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, who appear in reliefs playing at their parents' feet, clutching toys, reaching for their mothers' necklaces. The exact position of Tutankhaten among these children is debated by modern scholars, but within the palace, he is simply one more small figure in a family whose every movement is watched by guards, servants, and gods. His earliest lessons are simple ones: how to stand properly when a high official enters the room, how to walk without tripping over the edges of his linen kilt, how to hold a small offering bowl with both hands, steady and respectful. As he grows a little older, new lessons appear. Scribes show him rows of hieroglyphs, drawing them large and slow at first. The reed leaf, the seated man, the twisted flax. He learns to repeat the sounds, to feel the rhythm of his own language as it takes written form. His small hand grips a reed pen and tries to copy the shapes on a scrap of pottery or a worn piece of board. Sometimes the lines wobble and he frowns. Sometimes a scribe smiles and nods, and the boy feels a brief surge of pride. Everywhere in the palace, images of his father and the Aten surround him. On walls and stelae, Akhenaten and Nefertiti stand beneath the sun disk, its rays descending with tiny hands that offer ankhs, the sign of life, to their noses. Tutankhaten sees himself carved here and there as a small figure, perhaps seated on someone's lap or standing beside a sister. In these scenes, he is part of the sacred pattern. Royal family, sun disk, rays of life, no other gods. The stories he hears at night match the images on the walls. Priests and officials loyal to the Aten speak of one creator who made the Nile, the lands of Egypt, and the foreign countries beyond. They recite hymns that praise the Aten for giving breath to all creatures. For a child, this is the world. One God, one royal family, one bright city in the desert where everything seems new. And yet, the old Egypt has not truly vanished. Servants come from other towns. Guards have families in Thebes, Memphis, and distant villages along the floodplain. When they talk quietly among themselves, away from the formal ceremonies, fragments of older beliefs slip through. Someone mutters a proverb that mentions a moon. Someone gestures instinctively to an amulet of Bes or Taweret, tucked under a collar. Children hear more than adults think, and Tutankhaten's ears, like any child's, are sharp. Maybe once he asks a nurse about a name he was not supposed to hear. Who is Amun? The nurse hesitates, then smiles and says something gentle and vague. Perhaps she says it is an old word for the hidden power of the wind, or she changes the subject altogether, offering him a honey cake. The question hangs in the air like the smell of baking bread, familiar, tempting, and quickly swallowed. Outside the palace, Akhenaten is busy. Dusty streets carry messengers, craftsmen and officials from one quarter to another. There are gardens with ponds full of lotus and fish. There are stables with horses for the royal chariots. Workshops hum with activity as sculptors carve the king's elongated features and the tall, elegant crown of Nefertiti in block after block of stone. The boy prince sees chariots being repaired, arrows being fletched, furniture being inlaid with ivory. The city feels young, full of movement and possibility. Yet beneath that brightness, something else has begun. The boy would notice it only in small ways at first. Perhaps he overhears an argument between scribes about missing shipments from distant vassals. Perhaps he notices that certain courtiers who once stood close to his father no longer appear in the great hall. He might notice that some rooms in the palace feel strangely quiet, as if they were meant to be used more often but now stand half empty. At festivals the patterns change too. Once there might have been great crowds, music echoing through every street as the Aten's open-air temples filled. Later, the gatherings become thinner, less enthusiastic. People still praise the sun disk. They still bow when the royal chariot passes. But there is a tension in their shoulders, a distance in their eyes. Tutankhaten is a child, but he is not blind. He senses when adults are afraid. He feels the difference between a room full of honest excitement and a room where joy is being forced. He is also aware, in a vague but growing way, that his own life is tied to what happens in this city. He has a name that praises the Aten. His existence, in the eyes of the court, confirms the new order. A child of the sun's chosen king, growing up under the rays of a single god. We do not know how much he sees of Akhenaten himself. Perhaps the king sometimes lifts the boy up before the Aten's altar, letting the sunlight fall on his small face. Perhaps he watches from a short distance as his father and mother pray together, the sun's rays touching them with carved stone hands. He is too young to understand the politics of it, but he can feel the weight of the ritual. He can feel that in these moments he is expected to be calm, dignified, and still. In the quieter hours away from ceremony, he's just a boy. He chases a ball. He learns to handle small bows. He pets the sleek cats that roam the palace grounds. He listens to stories, some of them carefully approved, full of praise for the Aten, others told by older servants who slip in older legends by habit. Tales of the sky goddess Nut, of Osiris in the underworld, of Ra in his solar boat. These echoes of a crowded old pantheon drift through his childhood like distant music. Then the city's mood shifts again. Akhenaten's reign draws toward its end. The reasons are still debated, but the signs of strain are clear. Foreign letters speak of neglected allies and encroaching enemies. Economic disruptions ripple through the land as old temple networks remain crippled. Within Akhenaten, as within any experimental capital, there are those who still believe and those who quietly doubt. Tutankhaten is growing taller now. His limbs lengthen. His tutors give him more serious lessons. He learns about the two lands of Egypt, upper and lower, the crowns that symbolize them, the enemies beyond the borders. He learns in theory about the role of a king as shepherd, warrior and priest. Yet the model he sees is unusual. A father who's more priest-prophet than general, more focused on hymns than on foreign campaigns. When Akhenaten dies, the boy's world tilts. We do not know how the news reaches him. Perhaps in a whispered conversation before dawn, perhaps during a day when the palace seems strangely hushed, and servants move with swollen eyes and trembling hands. However it happens, the central figure of his universe is gone. After Akhenaten's death, the royal line becomes confusing in the records. There may be a short reign by a figure named Shmenkare. Nefertiti may have taken new titles and roles. The court struggles to decide how much of the Aten revolution to keep, how much to soften, and how to avoid outright collapse. For Tutankhaten, life becomes a swirl of changes. Rooms are reassigned. Officials who once spoke with total confidence now look uncertain. There are more urgent councils, more messengers coming and going, more nights when he lies awake hearing footsteps and voices in the corridors long after the lamps should have been extinguished. Behind the scenes, powerful men are making plans. I, the experienced courtier and advisor, knows the weight of tradition and the importance of a smooth succession. Horemheb, a military commander, knows the dangers facing Egypt beyond its borders and the value of a strong, stable kingship. The high priests who still remember Thebes, Karnak and Luxor know that the old gods cannot be kept in chains forever. They all look at the young Tutankhaten and see not just a boy, but a solution. He is of royal blood. He is young enough to be guided. He has no fully formed political faction of his own. And if he reorients his loyalty, if his very name shifts from Aten to Amun, he can become the living symbol of a restoration, a return to the old ways that can soothe the land and reweave the fabric of belief. The decision forms quietly. like a knot in the dark. Akhenaten, the city of the Aten, will not remain the capital. The court will return toward the old centres of power. The empty sunlit colonnade will one day fall silent, their reliefs half covered in drifting sand. The Aten will not vanish entirely, but it will step back into the wide, crowded sky, no longer the sole god at the centre. And the boy whose name praises the Aten will be asked to pivot. Tutankhaten stands on the threshold of kingship. He may not fully understand the forces that swirl around him, the grief, the anger, the urgency of those who survived his father's revolution. But he can feel that his life is about to change. He will leave the city he has always known. He will travel along the Nile toward older places, older temples, older gods. He will sit on a throne meant for someone much older than he is, and he will wear a crown whose weight no child can truly bear. The next time we see him, he will be called Tutankhamun. But for now, in these last days at Akhenaten, he is still the boy of the Aten, walking through courtyards where the sun is too bright, past altars that will soon stand empty, carrying within him the memory of a city that existed for only a brief blazing moment in Egypt's long unfolding story. Cities fade slowly, not with thunder but with the soft thinning of footsteps, fewer carts in the streets, fewer lamps burning at night, fewer voices echoing in courtyards that once hummed with purpose. For Tutankhaten, the boy prince in Akhenaten, the changes might have come like that, so gradual he couldn't name the moment everything shifted. One day the courtyards were full, the palaces humming with officials and artisans whose hands shaped stone and gold and painted plaster, and the next he noticed that some familiar faces were simply gone. A sculptor whose workshop he used to pass on his way to lessons no longer opened his doors. A scribe who had always stood near his father's throne was absent at audience, and servants muttered that someone had returned to Thebes, as if the city of many gods were a distant tide quietly rising again, pulling people back towards something older, something the desert wind could not erase. Akhenaten was dead. The Aten still crossed the sky each day, but the man who had built a whole city in its honour no longer sat on the throne. For a brief confusing period, other names flickered through the royal court. Perhaps Smenkhare, perhaps Nefertiti in a new guise. The details are tangled in the surviving records like papyrus that has been folded and refolded too many times. What matters for our story is the feeling, a sense that no one, not even the highest in the land, was entirely sure what shape the future should take. In the middle of this uncertainty stood Tutankhaten. He was not yet a man, but he was old enough to understand that his life had stepped into a place between childhood and adulthood, between one god and many, between a bold experiment and a cautious return. Behind the scenes, powerful figures were making plans. I, a seasoned courtier who had served under Akhenaten, and perhaps even earlier kings, knew the old ways intimately. He understood that Egypt could not bear to live forever with its traditional gods pushed aside and its key temples closed. Horemheb, a general who had commanded troops and seen the wider world, knew that Egypt's power beyond its borders had slipped during the Aten years. Vassals were uneasy. Enemies were testing the edges of the empire. The country needed not only inner peace, but outer strength. They and others like them looked at Tutankhaten and saw a path forward. He was young, malleable, and of royal blood. Most importantly, he was not personally responsible for the upheavals of the past decade. He had not ordered the closing of Amun's temples or the carving of Thebes' gods from its walls. He was a blank tablet onto which a new story could be written, or rather, an old story retold. And so, at some quiet council, a decision formed. The boy would be king. Not Tutankhaten, the child of the Aten's bright solitary horizon, but Tutankhamun, servant and image of the god whose name had been nearly erased. The journey away from Akhenaten must have felt surreal. Imagine the royal party preparing to leave the city. Chests are packed, treasures selected, statues of the king and Aten left behind or taken down. The wind carries dust along emptying streets. Some families follow the court, others stay a while longer, reluctant to abandon the houses they have built in this new place. The boy prince, now on the road to kingship, looks back one last time at the white walls and open temples of his childhood city. Then the caravan turns south, following the course of the Nile. The rhythm of the river is comforting and eternal. Palms sway along its banks. Fields stretch out in green strips, farmers bending over the crops. In the distance, old temples come into view, their pylons rising like stone gates to another age. The names of gods other than the Aten are still on the people's lips here, even if they have learned to speak them softly these past years. At Thebes, the great complex of Karnak stands waiting. Its columns still touch the sky, even if some inscriptions of Amun have been defaced. Its priests, sidelined under Akhenaten, still know the words of ancient hymns. At Luxor, the temple to Amun, Mut and Khonsu watches the river, its colonnades lined with silent stone figures. And across the water, the Valley of the Kings lies in its quiet hollows, holding generations of pharaohs in meticulously prepared tombs. Into this old world the boy of the new city arrives. His coronation as king of the two lands is both a political act and a ritual healing. In ceremonies that had been performed for centuries, he is crowned with the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt. He is given a full royal name, not just the simple Tutankhaten, but a series of titles linking him to Ma'at, to Ra, to the unbroken continuity of Egypt's kingship. Somewhere in that sequence of names, one key change is made. Aten is set aside. Amun returns. The boy's name becomes Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. It is more than a personal renaming. It is a signal to the entire kingdom. The old gods are coming back into the light. We can imagine the scene. The air is thick with incense. Priests chant in deep, measured tones. Gold and lapis ornaments catch the glow of torches. Tutankhamun, still slight and young beneath the ceremonial crowns, repeats words he's been carefully taught. He does not control every detail of this ceremony. Adults who stand behind him, seen and unseen, have scripted it all. But it is his face the country will see. His cartouche that will be carved on temple walls as the one under whom the restoration begins. Shortly after his coronation, a formal proclamation is issued, what we now know as the Restoration Stele. In it, the king, or rather the king's advisors speaking in his name, describes the state of the country under the previous regime. Temples neglected, shrines fallen into ruin, the gods turning their faces away. It speaks of the land in distress, of the gods who cease to hear prayers, of chaos creeping in where order once ruled. Then it announces his project, to restore the houses of the gods, to rebuild ruined sanctuaries, to replace stolen images, to renew offerings and festivals. In essence, it promises to heal the wound that Akhenaten's policies opened. Egypt breathed a sigh of relief. In Thebes, work resumed at Karnak and Luxor. Carvers chiselled new reliefs of Tutankhamun, making offerings to Amun, Mut, and other gods. Colour was restored to the stone. Priests returned to their roles, performing rituals no longer constrained by royal disfavour. Damaged or hidden statues of the gods were recarved, repainted or replaced. This restoration was mirrored across other cities. Temples previously neglected received resources and repairs. Hopeful local priests rededicated themselves to their gnomes' gods. The religious calendar filled once more with processions, music, and communal festivals. Tutankhamun is at the centre of all of this in image, if not always in decision. He appears in reliefs leading the way into temples, his hands raised in adoration, his body shown strong and idealised, the way scribes and artists have rendered kings for centuries. In truth, he's still a teenager, guided at every step by older men who understand the complexities of the state better than he can yet grasp. I, Horemheb, and other high officials stand at his back, sometimes literally in carved scenes, sometimes invisibly in the audience chambers where real policy is set. Yet even if he is led, he is not nothing. As he moves through ceremonies, he learns. He feels the weight of the crowns. He hears the chants. He senses the deep relief in the faces of the people who line the processional routes as the old god statues pass by again under the sun. The court itself adjusts. Many of the officials loyal to Akhenaten's strict Aten doctrine lose prominence. Some may quietly accept the change and stay on, careful to align themselves with the new direction. Others fade from the record altogether. New favourites emerge, men who speak confidently of Amun, who know how to manage relations with temples, who are comfortable working within the older rhythms of Egyptian religious life. The capital, for practical purposes, shifts away from Akhenaten. Tutankhamun and his court spend time in Memphis, closer to the administrative heart of the country, and the great temple of Ptah. The empty sun-baked city in the desert that once seemed to be the centre of everything begins to wither. Its palaces and houses, hastily built to begin with, start to crack in the heat and wind. Within a generation it will be mostly abandoned, left to be quarried for bricks and stone by local villagers. But in these early years of Tutankhamun's reign, the turning away has only just begun. Politically, the move back to tradition is a clever and necessary gambit. But it does not erase all problems. Abroad, Egypt's authority has been questioned. Vassal states that once counted on swift Egyptian intervention during Akhenaten's more inward-looking years felt neglected. Enemies in the north and east tested borders and raided territories. Horemheb, as general, sees the need to reassert Egyptian strength with campaigns and diplomatic missions. Yet the resources to do so are not limitless, and the country is still recovering from the disruption of a religious revolution that drained attention and funds. At home, not everyone is pleased all at once. Some people had truly embraced the Aten devotion and feel disoriented by the swing back. Others had prospered in Akhenaten's new order and now find themselves displaced or diminished. There are private resentments, hidden calculations, quiet manoeuvrings for position near the young king. Through all this, Tutankhamun is growing. His legs lengthen. He practices archery and chariot driving. He meets ambassadors and watches their faces as they present gifts and repeat their flattering phrases. He's tutored in the old myths that Akhenaten had tried to sideline. The story of Osiris and Isis, of Horus and Seth, of Ra's journey in the sunboat. He must learn not just the words, but the sense of continuity, the feeling that he stands in an unbroken line reaching back through generations of kings, even though he and his advisors know that line was recently and dramatically bent. He also marries. His bride is Ankhesenpaten, later Ankhesenamun, a princess of the same tangled royal family that produced him. Their union is meant to stabilize the dynasty, to heal political fractures by joining branches of the family tree. For them, as individuals, it means sharing the strange weight of being both very young and symbolically old, carrying the expectations of a civilization on their slim shoulders. Around them, artisans are busy preparing objects they hope will not be needed for many years. Furniture, jewellery, ceremonial weapons, and the beginnings of a royal burial equipment suitable for a pharaoh. Tomb builders work in the Valley of the Kings on projects whose final occupants may not yet be decided, carving passages into the rock, smoothing walls, sketching the first outlines of protective scenes. No one can yet know that for Tutankhamun, time will be shorter than anyone expects. No one can know that the full grand tomb usually prepared for a king will never be finished for him. For now, the future still seems open, the restoration still in progress, the boy king's reign a path that might stretch on for decades. But in the background, the clock is already ticking. His body carries its own frailties, the land carries its own tensions, and the Valley of the Kings, with its many prepared tombs and its few unclaimed spaces, is waiting, not for a distant old age, but for a sudden, hurried funeral that will one day make his name echo louder than any of the mighty pharaohs who came before him. For the moment, though, Tutankhamun stands in the glow of newly restored temples, listening to the sound of Amun's priests chanting once more, trying to believe that the world has been put back on its proper axis, and that he will have enough time to grow into the king everyone needs him to be. When the dust of the Amarna revolution began to settle, Tutankhamun's Egypt entered a time of careful mending, not dramatic like Akhenaten's upheaval with its blazing new capital rising from bare desert, but the slow work of repair, brick by brick, statue by statue, ritual by ritual, like hands smoothing wrinkled linen until the creases fade. For a boy king still not fully grown, it meant waking each day into a kingdom that was trying to remember how to be itself, and you can picture him standing in temple courtyards where workers chiselled Amun's name back into walls that had been scraped clean, where priests who had hidden in silence for years now returned wearing leopard skins and carrying incense, their voices rising in hymns that had almost been forgotten. The old gods were coming home, their statues lifted from storage, their shrines rebuilt with fresh gold leaf that caught morning light, and everywhere the message was the same. We're restoring Ma'at. We're putting the world back in balance. We're undoing the break. From his palace, whether in Memphis in the north or Thebes in the south, Tutankhamun would have risen in the cool of early morning, when the air was still soft and the light low on the horizon. Servants would help him dress, fine linen, jewellery of gold and semi-precious stones, a wig carefully arranged. He would be fed fruits, bread, and perhaps a little meat, while scribes murmured the day's appointments and important petitions. Much of what he was told was about restoration. Temples needed rebuilding, statues needed re-erecting, priests long sidelined needed formal reinstatement. The restoration stele already issued in his name was not just a piece of propaganda, it was a to-do list carved in stone. It declared that under previous kings the temples had fallen into neglect, the gods had turned away, and the land suffered. Under Tutankhamun it promised the proper order would be restored. And so, across the country, work began. In Thebes, the great temple of Amen at Karnak thrummed with renewed activity. The scars of Akhenaten's policies were still there, names of Amun hacked away, reliefs damaged. But now teams of craftsmen set ladders against the walls and began to correct them. They carved new images of the god, new scenes of the boy king making offerings, new lines of prayer. The sound of chisels rang between the columns, echoing up into the high, shadowed spaces. Nearby, at Luxor, workmen cleaned and repaired reliefs along the colonnades. Festival routes were cleared so that, once again during great feasts like Opet, the god's statue could be carried in procession from Karnak to Luxor, borne on the shoulders of priests and accompanied by musicians, dancers, and a murmuring crowd. Tutankhamun, as king, would have had to appear at the centre of these ceremonies. He would stand in a gilded bark or ride in a chariot while people chanted his names and titles. He would enter the cool dimness of temple halls and pour libations before the restored statues, reciting words that linked him to ancient kings who had done the same for hundreds of years before him. In those moments, the boy, however uncertain he might have felt in private, wore the mask of eternity. Beyond Thebes, the same pattern repeated in smaller temples and shrines. In provincial towns, local priests dusted off old ritual books and brushed aside cobwebs from disused sanctuaries. They sent petitions to the royal court requesting funds and materials to repair roofs, repaint walls, and replace sacred barks. Response times might be slow. Egypt was large, resources limited. But even a small shipment of stone or grain from the central administration was a sign that the old bonds were being recognized again. The administration itself had to be rebuilt as well. Years of focus on Akhenaten and the Aten cult had disrupted normal channels. Some officials had died or fallen from favour. Some records had been neglected. Under Tutankhamun, scribes and viziers worked to reweave the fabric of government, reassigning offices, auditing temple lands, reaffirming who owed what to the state and to which god. In this work, the men behind the throne were crucial. I, with his long experience at court, handled much of the delicate diplomacy between crown and temple. Horemheb, as general, looked to the borders and the distant garrisons, reminding everyone that a rich, pious kingdom still needed soldiers to protect it. They advised the young king, drafted decrees in his name, and ensured that the image of decisive action was maintained even while decisions were, in truth, made by older hands. Yet Tutankhamun was not simply a puppet. He was growing, learning, and absorbing the rhythms of kingship as he went. He would have sat in council chambers, listening as officials argued about where to send grain in times of shortage, how to respond to a letter from a foreign ruler, or how much wealth could be directed to temple projects without starving the army of pay. He might not have grasped every nuance, especially in his earliest years, but he would have seen the faces of those who spoke, the way their voices rose or fell, the way they looked toward him for a final nod. He also had ritual obligations that no advisor could fully take over. On certain days he had to personally perform offerings, personally speak sacred formulas, personally appear before the people. The physical strain of some ceremonies, standing for long periods, walking in procession under heavy crowns and collars, would have been felt in his own bones and muscles. Later studies of his mummy suggest that his body may have been frail, with issues in his legs and feet. If so, each ritual was not just a symbolic burden, but a literal one. Meanwhile, outside the temples and palaces, ordinary life adjusted. Farmers in the floodplain still sowed and reaped with the seasons. Artisans in towns and villages still carved furniture, baked pottery, and wove textiles. But the return of the old gods to official favour gave daily life a renewed texture of comfort. People once again felt free to pray openly to the many deities who watched over childbirth, illness, harvest, and travel. Amulets of Bez and Taweret hung from more necks and doorways, no longer hidden. Festivals with their music and feasting returned as bright points in the year, offering rest and shared joy. Far to the west across the river from Thebes, in the desert heights, another community played its part, the workmen's village of what we now call Deir el-Medina. There, a tight-knit group of artisans and their families lived in modest houses lined up along a narrow street. Their job was to carve and decorate the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings and nearby valleys. Under Tutankhamun, they would have gone each day over the ridge or around the cliffs, descending into half-finished tunnels and chambers, lamplight flickering on bare rock. They traced outlines of gods and spells, chiselled scenes, and painted walls with the colours of rebirth and protection. We do not know exactly which tombs they worked on in his reign, but we know that traditionally, as soon as a king took the throne, a tomb was begun for him. Somewhere in the valley, tunnels were probably started for Tutankhamun too, though they would never be completed for him. Each blow of a hammer in that underground world was an investment in a future that everyone assumed he had. Decades of life, a long reign, and a slow, dignified preparation for eternity. Beyond Egypt's borders, the world did not stand still. Letters from foreign rulers arrived on clay tablets. Kings of Hatti, Mitanni, Babylon, and vassal princes in Canaan and Syria. Some congratulated the new pharaoh, others pressed old complaints. During the Amarna period, when Akhenaten's focus had been more on theology than on diplomacy, Egyptian responses had sometimes been slow or insufficient. Now, under Tutankhamun, there was a need to repair those relationships too. Horemheb and other commanders likely led or at least planned campaigns and diplomatic missions to reassert Egyptian influence in the Near East. Troops marched along dusty roads, ships sailed along the coast, emissaries carried gifts and reassurances. However, the historical record suggests that Tutankhamun's reign was too short, and his government still too busy with internal healing to fully reverse all the losses of earlier years. Inside the palace, Tutankhamun's private life unfolded alongside these public concerns. He and Ankhesenamun shared not only a throne but a childhood marked by turmoil. They may have drawn comfort from each other's presence, speaking in quieter moments about the cities they had known, the ceremonies they had endured, the pressure that surrounded them. There is evidence that they conceived children. Tiny mummies found in his tomb suggest that 2 daughters were born and died in infancy. These losses would have added another layer of sorrow and urgency to their lives. An heir would have strengthened the dynasty. The failure of their children to survive left a hole that circumstances would later exploit. Still, in the flow of daily life, there must have been moments of simple humanity. Laughter at a jest in the palace gardens, a quiet walk in the cool of evening among lotus ponds, games played on carved boards, throwing knuckle bones or casting lots, lessons in music, where the soft notes of a harp or flute filled a shaded courtyard. Even a king, even a queen, even in an age of heavy expectation, would have had these pockets of ordinary feeling. Yet through it all, time continued its steady, indifferent march. Tutankhamun's reign, as far as we can tell, lasted only about 9 years. In those years, the country stepped back from the edge of religious fragmentation. Temples breathed again. The image of the king as protector of Ma'at, the divine order, was carefully repainted over the cracks of recent history. From the outside and from the vantage point of later centuries, it might look like not much happened. No vast new conquests, no truly monumental temples of his own, no great innovations, but sometimes quiet repair is itself a monumental achievement. Tutankhamun's Egypt did not collapse into permanent civil war after the Amarna experiment. It did not fragment into many small kingdoms. It did not abandon its ancient gods forever. Under a boy king and the older men around him, it found a way back to something like itself. No one at the time knew that his name would disappear from most later king lists, that later rulers would try to erase the whole Amarna era, bundling Akhenaten and his successors, including Tutankhamun, into an awkward silence. No one knew that centuries later, his almost completely intact tomb would be discovered, and his name would become more widely known than that of any conqueror. For now he was simply a young pharaoh in a long line, doing what could be done in the short span allowed to him, rebuilding what was broken, carrying rituals forward, and walking, perhaps a little carefully, under the weight of crowns that had sat upon heads far older, and would soon, far sooner than anyone expected, rest on someone else's. If we step closer now, past the towering statues and the carved reliefs that show Tutankhamun as a flawless, ageless king, we find a quieter world behind the palace walls. There, away from the public eye, the boy king becomes simply a young person trying to live a life that was never truly his own choice. Imagine an early morning in the royal residence. The city beyond the walls is just beginning to stir. Donkeys bray in distant courtyards. Bakers slide loaves into hot ovens. The Nile carries a faint, cool breeze up through the streets. In the palace, lamps burn low in long corridors. Servants move barefoot across polished floors, carrying fresh water in jars, quietly opening shutters to let in the growing light. In one chamber, a young king wakes. He does not spring from bed as the images show him, already perfect and poised. He blinks, stretches, feels the stiffness in his limbs. Modern studies of his body suggest he may have had problems with his feet and legs. If that is true, then even the act of sitting up, standing and stepping onto the cool floor might have been something he approached slowly, carefully, with the help of a servant or a nurse. Attendants bring him water in a basin, scented perhaps with a little lotus or oil. They wash his face and hands. They help him into fine linen garments, wrapping and smoothing the fabric so it falls in precise, elegant folds. Gold and semi-precious stones are added, a broad collar at the chest, bracelets at wrists and ankles, earrings if he chooses to wear them. A wig of carefully made hair is set in place. By the time they are done, the boy inside the clothes looks very much like the idealized figure carved on temple walls. Yet beneath the linen and gold is a real body, a body that may ache, a body that has known illness, a body that will not live long. Physicians in the palace do what they can. They bring ointments, herbal infusions, poultices. They have knowledge built up over centuries, recorded on papyri and passed from master to apprentice. They know how to set bones, how to treat wounds, how to ease certain pains. But there are limits to what any medicine of that time can do, especially for conditions present from birth. Tutankhamun knows those limits in a personal way. He likely has days when he feels well enough to move easily through the halls, to climb into a chariot, to stand for long ceremonies. He also has days when he's tired before noon, when his legs protest, when the thought of putting on the heavy crowns and collars feels like lifting stones. Despite this, the routine continues. After dressing and a modest meal, he meets tutors and advisors, Some hours of the morning are given to learning. He's not a simple puppet. He must understand the basic framework of the world he rules. He studies geography, the shape of Egypt like a long green ribbon along the Nile, the lands beyond, Nubia to the south, the deserts to the east and west, the contested territories in the north and northeast. He hears the names of foreign kings and cities, the routes of caravans, the ports where Egyptian ships trade. He also learns stories. Scribes and priests teach him the ancient myths that connect his office to the gods. He hears of Osiris, the murdered king of the underworld, whose death and resurrection promise life after death for all. He hears of Isis, the devoted wife and mother, who reassembles Osiris and protects their son Horus. He hears of Horus himself, the falcon god, who fights against the chaotic Seth and brings order back to the land. In these stories, Tutankhamun can see reflections of his own role, a son of a troubled line, expected to restore balance after conflict. Sometimes he must practice the rituals that go with those stories. He learns the proper way to pour libations, how many times to bow, where to stand in relation to the god statue. He memorizes phrases spoken in archaic language, words older than the current dynasty, older than any human memory. His young voice speaks them with care, knowing that any slip will be noticed, if not excused. Around midday, the palace grows hotter. Thick walls and shaded courtyards help, but the Egyptian sun seeps into everything. Servants fan the air, bringing small relief. The king eats again. Bread, fruit, perhaps roast fowl, perhaps a sweet made with honey and dates. Musicians might play softly nearby, harps, flutes, lyres, offering a gentle curtain of sound while he rests. In these calmer hours he may meet artisans bringing new works for his approval. A goldsmith presents an inlaid pectoral showing the king beneath the wings of a protective deity. A carpenter shows a chair carved with lion heads and covered in fine paint. A sculptor reveals a small statue of Tutankhamun himself, idealized but still bearing, in the line of the jaw or the tilt of the head, a hint of the real young man. He might run his fingers over the smooth wood, the cool metal, the tiny details that only a close eye can see. He knows that many of these pieces will one day accompany him into the tomb. That knowledge is both comforting and eerie. In Egypt, the boundary between life and death is not a harsh wall but a permeable veil. Even as he lives, he's always half preparing for the next world. There are lighter moments too. In the gardens within the palace walls, Tutankhamun can walk or sit among pools where lotus flowers float and fish move lazily beneath the surface. Palm trees offer patches of shade. Birds nest in branches and hop along the paths. He might play senet, the board game beloved by Egyptians, moving pieces along a grid that symbolically echoes the soul's journey through the afterlife. He might throw sticks or balls, practice with a bow in a controlled courtyard, or watch trained dogs and monkeys perform tricks. Akhenaten is there as well. She's not only his great royal wife in ritual, but also a companion in this strange life. They likely grew up knowing each other, sharing, tutors and attendants. Now as husband and wife, they share more than just ceremony. They share the pressure of expectation. They share the private griefs that do not make it into inscriptions, the loss of infants, the uncertainty about the future, the knowledge that their marriage is as political as it is personal. In the evenings they may sit together while the light fades and the air cools. They watch the sky turn from blue to gold to deep violet. Servants bring lamps and place them in careful rows. The sounds of the city beyond the palace grow softer, replaced by the chirping of night insects and the occasional distant bark of a dog. they talk. Perhaps they speak of simple things, a new song they heard, a funny gesture from a younger servant, a beautiful piece of jewellery. Perhaps sometimes they speak in careful, guarded words about the past, the strange brightness of Akhenaten, the heavy weight of their family's decisions, the gods whose names have changed on their lips. Modern science gives us glimpses of Tutankhamun's physical state, but not his inner voice. We know he likely had a clubfoot. We know there were issues with his spine and limbs. We know he carried traces of malaria in his blood, but we do not know whether he was proud or shy, quick to laugh or easily angered, hopeful or often afraid. We can only infer from the world around him, from the political tensions, from the short span of his reign, from the tenderness implied by the objects buried with him. That tenderness shows in details. The chairs in his tomb are sized for a young man, not a towering giant. Some have footrests carved with images of defeated enemies, a traditional symbol, but the wear on the edges suggests they are actually used, not purely ceremonial. The gaming boards show signs of play. The small walking sticks, dozens of them, hint at a life lived with physical support always close at hand. They are not props for a painting. They are tools of a daily struggle. In the moments when he is alone, perhaps lying on a couch in a quiet room, staring up at a ceiling painted with stars, Tutankhamun must have sometimes felt the gap between the way he's portrayed and the way he feels. In reliefs, he strides forward with a bow, tramples enemies, offers perfect sacrifices. In reality, his steps may be uneven, his breath short after long rites, his body exhausted by obligations that do not respect his limits. And yet, that gap is something all kings experience in some form. The image on the wall is always more than the human who stands before it. Tutankhamun's particular frailties simply make the contrast sharper. As his short reign progresses, the weight of time grows heavier. He is no longer a child, but not yet an old man. There is still much he has not done. Temples restored under his name could use more work. Foreign policy remains fragile. An heir has not survived infancy. The delicate balance between crown, army and priesthood still depends on careful negotiation. Some days he may feel as though he is catching up, that he's finally stepping into a role that once felt too large. Other days he may sense, without being able to prove it, that his body will not grant him the decades his predecessors enjoyed. In quiet conversations, physicians and advisors might discuss his health in hushed tones. Akhenaten might watch him more closely, noting every wince, every delay in rising, every night when sleep comes too late or too restlessly. For now, though, from the outside the story appears steady. The boy king has become a young man. Temples are working, festivals are held, decrees are issued. He rides in ceremonial chariots. He appears at the head of processions. He gives gifts and receives ambassadors. Life continues in the palace, woven from duty and small joys. No inscription warns that the end is near. No temple wall carries a hint that his tomb will be a rushed, improvised space, filled in a hurry by men working against time. No one has carved yet the 4 small rooms in the Valley of the Kings that will hold the compressed remains of his earthly life. But the body inside the fine linen still has its limits, and somewhere, beneath the western cliffs, workmen are cutting into the rock, not yet knowing whose name will one day be written over the doorway of a small tomb that was never meant to be famous. Every life, even one wrapped in gold and ritual, is a thread that can break without warning, and in the palace the pattern of Tutankhamun's days would have seemed unchanged on the surface. petitions to be heard, festivals to attend, rituals to perform, the endless rhythm of kingship that demanded he step into chariots and lift goblets at banquets, and walk through columned halls lined with painted scenes of gods and kings. But his body was not as steady as the stone around him, and the evidence pulled from his mummy thousands of years later tells a story of vulnerabilities hidden beneath royal linen. A spine that curved wrong, feet shaped differently than they should have been, bones that whisper of congenital problems passed down through generations of royal intermarriage. There are signs that malaria lived in his blood, the disease carried by mosquitoes that buzzed in the marshes and along the riverbanks, and one of his legs bears a serious injury. A fracture near the knee where the bone shows damage that could have caused immense pain and made every step an effort, every movement a negotiation with suffering. We do not know exactly how that injury happened. Perhaps it was a chariot accident. Kings were expected to drive chariots, to hunt from them, to show their prowess in controlled displays of speed and skill. Imagine the thin rims of the wheels rolling over uneven ground, the horses surging forward, the reins tightening in his hands. One misjudged turn, one stone in the wrong place, one shift in weight, and a fall could come suddenly, hard and unforgiving. Perhaps it was a fall indoors, a misstep on a staircase on a day when his legs were already weak, a moment's imbalance sending him crashing where a healthier man might have caught himself. In a world of stone floors and sharp-edged furniture, any fall could be serious. However it occurred, the damage to his leg was real, and in a time without antibiotics, without modern surgery, any such injury carried grave risks. Infection could creep in through broken skin. Fever could rise and fall like a cruel tide. Pain could make sleep fitful and dreams uneasy. Around him, physicians did what they could. They washed the wound with water and wine, pressed herbal poultices against it, chanted protective spells as they worked. They burned incense in the sick room, hoping not only to please the gods but to purify the air. They monitored his breathing, his pulse at the throat, the colour of his face. They offered draughts of bitter-tasting medicine, hoping it might bring down the heat in his veins. Tutankhamun, still so young, bore it all as best he could. Some days the pain may have eased. On those days he might have insisted on getting up, on performing at least some of his duties, unwilling to appear weak before courtiers and servants who watched his every movement. On other days the sickness may have surged, leaving him sweating and shivering, too exhausted to rise. At those times the subtle machinery of palace life would have tried to cover his absence, advisors handling minor matters, rituals quietly postponed or performed without him when possible. Outside his chambers, and Horemheb would have felt a different kind of fever rising. They knew what the kingdom needed, a ruler who could preside over the fragile restoration they'd begun. They also knew the line of succession was thin. Tutankhamun and Ankhesenamun's daughters had died in infancy. No surviving son is known. If the young king died, there was no obvious unchallenged heir waiting in the wings. In other words, they were not just watching a patient. They were watching a living hinge, the point on which the entire balance of Egypt's future might swing. As the illness deepened, the palace atmosphere grew heavy. Servants whispered in corners. Messages were sent to key officials to stand ready. Priests were called to perform rituals for healing and protection, invoking gods whose names had only recently been officially welcomed back into the light. Ankhesenamun remained at his side as much as she could. She'd grown up in turmoil, but nothing quite like this. Not political uncertainty, but the immediate personal fear of losing the one person who shared her strange position. She would have sat near the bed, perhaps holding his hand when fever allowed, offering cool water, speaking softly during more lucid moments. She may have reminded him of gentle memories, a festival they had attended, a day in the gardens, a moment of laughter at some small mischief by a servant or a pet. At some point, it would have become clear, even to non-experts, that he was not improving. His breathing more shallow, his skin more pale or flushed, his strength not returning as quickly as everyone hoped. Priests came with more serious rituals then. They brought statues and amulets, recited prayers to Sekhmet, goddess of plague and healing, asking her to turn her fierce head away. They appealed to Thoth for wisdom, to Isis for protection, to Ammon for mercy. The words had been spoken over many sickbeds across centuries. Sometimes the gods seemed to listen, sometimes they did not. For Tutankhamun they did not. The moment of death itself is always quiet. No inscription records the exact day or hour. We do not know who was in the room when he took his last breath, but we can imagine the stillness that followed, the way voices dropped away, the way people's hands stilled in mid-motion, the way one physician, perhaps, reached out gently to touch the king's neck or chest, then looked to the others and gave a small, definitive shake of the head. In that instant, a life ended. In the same instant, a new and pressing problem began. According to Egyptian belief, the dead, especially a dead king, needed careful treatment if they were to live on in the afterlife. The body had to be preserved. The proper rituals had to be performed. The tomb had to be ready to receive him, furnished with everything he would need. And all of this had to be done within a fixed span of time, traditionally about 70 days, the period of mummification. But Tutankhamun had died young, and not everyone had expected his end so soon. His reign had been short. The realm was still recovering from earlier chaos. The architectural machine that normally worked steadily on a pharaoh's monumental tomb over decades had not had enough time to build something of the usual scale for him. Some tomb work had likely begun, but nothing on the level of the great multi-chambered palaces dug for long-lived kings like Thutmose III or Amenhotep III. Now, suddenly, those responsible had to answer a brutal question. Where will we bury the king? They could not leave his body unburied beyond the proper time. They could not send him to the afterlife without the necessary coffins, containers, and grave goods. They also had to think about politics. A smoothly executed royal funeral was more than piety. It was a public demonstration of continuity. It showed that the state was functioning, that the next ruler was in control, that Ma'at, the divine order, still held. I, in particular, would have felt the urgency. As a senior advisor, possibly the highest official in the land after the king, he would have known that he might soon step forward as successor. But his claim would only be seen as legitimate if Tutankhamun's burial was handled correctly, respectfully, visibly, and in line with tradition. So the clock began to tick. Embalmers went to work, removing organs, drying the body with natron, wrapping it in layer after layer of linen. Priests recited spells as each amulet was placed. The golden mask was prepared to cover the face, linking the boy king's fragile features to the timeless, idealized visage of Osiris and Ra. At the same time, scribes and officials scoured the Valley of the Kings and its surroundings for a suitable tomb. The full, grand tomb envisioned for a pharaoh of uninterrupted reign was not ready. Another, smaller tomb, likely intended for a noble or secondary royal, was recently excavated or already available. A compact layout with a descending corridor, a small antechamber, a tight burial chamber, and a side room. It was not ideal. It was cramped. Its walls offered only one main space suitable for painting. But it was there, and it could be finished quickly. Tutankhamun's final resting place was chosen not because it matched his royal status perfectly, but because it could be made ready in time. In the palace storerooms and workshops, a second race against time began. Funerary furniture, chariots, beds, chests, statues, shrines, and containers had to be selected, finished, or adapted. Some pieces had been made specifically for Tutankhamun. Others were repurposed from items prepared for different individuals. Names were altered, inscriptions were recut. A coffin shaped for someone else could be dedicated to him with new hieroglyphs and minor adjustments. What mattered most was that the tomb be filled with enough to sustain him in the afterlife and to signal his status to the gods. The painters in the tomb worked quickly. They smoothed the plaster on the walls of the burial chamber, sketched outlines in red, corrected them in black, then applied pigment. Scenes were chosen for their power and clarity rather than their complexity. Tutankhamun greeted by Osiris, Tutankhamun embraced by deities, rituals ensuring his safe passage. The hand of one master painter can be seen across much of the decoration, suggesting a small, focused team working under intense pressure. Torchlight flickered as brushes moved, as colours dried, as the final touches were added. There was no time for endless refinement. The images are beautiful, but when compared to the vast, intricate programs of larger tombs, they feel concise, almost compressed, like a ritual spoken a little faster than usual because night is coming. In the palace, Akhenaten watched the preparations, knowing that each step, each wrapped amulet, each painted figure brought her closer to the final parting. Her grief would have had little private space. Queens were expected to be seen at funerary rites, to play their role in public mourning. But somewhere, in some smaller, quieter room, she must have wept simply as a young woman who had lost her husband, companion, and fellow survivor of a strange childhood. When the 70 days were nearly over, everything was set in motion for the burial. A procession from the living city to the silent valley, a body wrapped and masked, a tomb far smaller than anyone once imagined for a king, but packed nearly to bursting with the hurried work of hearts, hands, and time-strapped devotion. Tutankhamun's death had come suddenly. His burial would be the best that could be done in a world that had not planned well enough for the death of a boy who'd become a king too soon and was taken just as he was beginning to grow into the role. In the western hills across from Thebes, the Valley of the Kings lay quiet as it always tried to appear, just a maze of pale cliffs and stony gullies where the sun hammered all day and the wind scraped clean at night. And only those who knew where to look could see the cut mouths of tomb entrances, the traces of old ramps and spoil heaps, the scars of human hands on the bones of the earth. Into this valley Tutankhamun's funeral procession came at last, the young king's body swaddled in linen and crowned with gold, travelling from the world of breathing and sunlight into the carved darkness prepared for him, while priests chanted and mourning women cried out in formal ritualized grief, and high officials walked with measured steps, each movement rehearsed, each gesture a stitch in the fabric meant to hold Mayat together even as a pharaoh passed away. Yet behind the solemn ritual there was a sense of improvisation, because the tomb waiting for him was small, far smaller than a king deserved. perhaps originally cut for a noble or a high official, and now hastily repurposed because death had come too soon, and there was no time to carve the grand chambers a pharaoh's eternity required. You can picture the workers rushing in the final days, plastering walls that still smelled of fresh limestone, painting scenes of the afterlife in quick strokes while the funeral date loomed closer, stacking treasures into rooms that could barely hold them all. Chariots and beds and thrones and boxes of clothing and jars of food and wine, everything a king might need in the next world, all crammed together like a royal storage room rather than the spacious halls his ancestors enjoyed. Tutankhamun's tomb, now known to us as KV62, was not the long, grand corridor of chambers that earlier mighty kings had enjoyed. It was small, almost modest by royal standards. A short staircase led down from what would one day be a cluttered workman's hut and rubble pile. At the base of the stairs, a corridor turned and descended again. At the end of that passage, a doorway opened into a compact antechamber. Beyond that, a low doorway pierced the wall into a slightly larger burial chamber. A side room, the annex, branched off the antechamber. Another, the treasury, opened from the burial chamber. 4 rooms. Not the sprawling, multi-corridored palace of eternity that a pharaoh normally commanded, but something closer in scale to a high noble's tomb, or perhaps a burial originally intended for someone of lesser rank. For the men responsible for burying Tutankhamun, this was both a problem and an opportunity. The problem was obvious: how to fit a king's afterlife into such a small space. The opportunity lay in the simple fact that the tomb already existed, or could be finished quickly. At a time when 70 days ticked away like a countdown in natron and linen, speed mattered more than grandeur. Before the funeral procession arrived, the tomb had been a workplace. Carvers had cut the rooms into the limestone, clearing debris, smoothing the floors as best they could. In most royal tombs, every wall would be covered in intricate scenes from the Netherworld books, long texts and complex illustrations of the sun's journey through 12 hours of darkness, of apes greeting dawn, snakes guarding gates, and boats crossing celestial waters. Tutankhamun's burial chamber, by contrast, would bear only a small, focused set of scenes. Plasterers spread a thin layer over the burial chamber walls, levelling the rough stone. Painters sketched the outlines of figures and hieroglyphs, then filled them with yellow, blue, green, black and red. There was no time for every chapter of every sacred text. Instead, they chose essential episodes: the king embraced by Osiris, the opening of the mouth ritual being performed, deities welcoming him into their realm. It was like condensing an entire library into a single, well-chosen scroll. As they worked, others far above ground were scrambling to assemble the grave goods. For a pharaoh, the tomb was not just a place to lie still. It was a complete microcosm of life, a storehouse of tools, furniture, food, clothing, weapons and symbols that would allow the king to continue his existence in the next world as fully as he had in this one. Bed frames, couches shaped like lions and cows, chairs and stools, chariots, boxes of linens, jars of wine and oil, baskets of provisions, statues of servants and gods, all had to be brought together. Some items had been made with Tutankhamun's cartouches from the start. Others, in the rush, were repurposed. A gilded coffin, originally inscribed for a royal woman, perhaps, had its name erased and replaced with his. Decorative panels bearing another king's name were altered, the old signs chiselled out, and new ones carved in their place. The craftsmen moved quickly and cleverly, hiding the seams where they could, but for a careful modern eye the traces remain. mismatched masculine and feminine pronouns in inscriptions, stylistic clues from earlier reigns, the ghost of another name under his. When the day of burial came, the tomb was ready. Barely. The procession reached the valley. Priests intoned spells and hymns, swinging incense burners that trailed fragrant smoke. At the mouth of the tomb the air was cooler, tinged with the scent of limestone dust and the faint bitterness of paint and plaster. Torchlight flickered on rough walls as the first objects were carried in. Down the stairs, along the corridor, and into the antechamber they went. There, chaos took on a kind of sacred order. A life's worth of possessions and the symbols of a king's rule had to be arranged in a handful of spaces. Chariots were disassembled and leaned against the walls. Beds and couches were stacked and nested. Great shrines and chests were manoeuvred into position with difficulty. Statues were lined up shoulder to shoulder. Boxes were piled atop one another, their lids pressed tight, their contents carefully recorded by scribes who stood in the torchlight, writing as quickly as they could manage in careful hieratic script on jar labels and door plaster. There was consideration in the chaos. Objects of similar function tended to gather together. Certain protective figures were placed to watch over certain directions. But to walk into that room, as Howard Carter would do thousands of years later, was to see not a neat showroom, but a space used to its absolute limit, every corner filled, every surface pressed into service. Beyond the antechamber, the burial chamber waited with its painted walls and its central stone sarcophagus. Here, the layering became even more intense. First came the great wooden gilded shrines, huge box-like structures, one inside another like nested dolls, each adorned with protective spells and images. They were assembled around the sarcophagus, filling the room so completely that little space remained between them and the walls. Within the sarcophagus lay the nested coffins, outer wooden and gilded coffins. Then, at the core, the astonishing solid gold coffin that wrapped his mummified body like a second metal skin. Each layer was an act of protection, an additional shell between the king and decay, between him and any threat that might reach him in the darkness. The treasury, a side room off the burial chamber, became a sanctuary for particularly potent objects. The canopic chest that held his embalmed organs, guarded by figures of goddesses, statues of Anubis and other deities, chests of jewellery and ritual equipment. The annex off the antechamber became a compact maze of food offerings, wine jars and miscellaneous items, as though the packers had simply run out of time and space and begun to fill it as best they could. All the while, the clock of ritual necessity was ticking. Outside, the world was watching. Not every farmer or craftsman knew the details of the burial, but everyone knew the king was dead, and everyone waited to see that he was buried properly. Inside the court, ambitious men watched too, measuring their own chances of advancement in the shadow of his passing. I, in particular, stepped forward. At the burial, someone had to perform the opening of the mouth ceremony, an ancient sacred act in which the deceased king's senses and faculties were symbolically restored, so he could eat, speak, and see in the afterlife. In scenes painted on the wall, A is shown in the role of the Sem-priest, performing that rite for Tutankhamun. It was a powerful image, the old advisor giving life back to the dead king, even as he, I, prepared to take up the living crown. When the last amulet had been placed, the last spell spoken, the last object nudged into its assigned position, there was one final task: sealing the tomb. Workers carried plaster and blocks to the doorways. They walled up the entrance from the antechamber to the corridor, leaving only a small space for a priest to pass during the final sequence of rituals. They smoothed the outer plaster surface and stamped it with the necropolis seal, a jackal over 9 bound captives, the emblem of Anubis watching over enemies of the king. When all was done, they filled the corridor with rubble and stones, disguising the approach, then likely levelled or used the area above the entrance for later construction and debris. On the surface, the valley returned to its usual deceptive emptiness. The men who had laboured in the heat and darkness walked back to their village. Their tools were stored. The last torches went out in the tunnel. A new reign would soon be proclaimed. I would be king, at least for a short time. Akhenaten would face her own terrifying uncertainty. Horemheb would wait, watching, for his turn. And under a thin layer of rubble, behind a sealed doorway, in chambers crowded with furniture and finery, Tutankhamun lay in his hastily appropriated tomb. Because it was small, because it was tucked away below later constructions, because it was not a grand, obvious entrance like some others, it survived. Looters came to the valley, as they always did in the centuries that followed. They broke into tombs, stripped gold from coffins, smashed jars, tore precious gems from settings. But Tutankhamun's little tomb, partly hidden, partly protected by the wreckage of other work above it, escaped their full attention. There were signs of at least one ancient break-in and resealing, but the core of the burial remained intact. The haste that had once seemed like a compromise became, in the long arc of time, a kind of blessing. The small scale, the reused objects, the crowded rooms, everything that had looked makeshift to those present at the funeral turned into a perfectly preserved snapshot of an age in transition. The short, unexpected life of a young king, ending in a hurried burial in a secondary tomb, would one day give the modern world its most complete, dazzling look into the royal life of ancient Egypt. For now, though, the valley above was quiet. Sand shifted. Occasional rains carved new lines in the gullies. Dynasties came and went. The name of Tutankhamun faded from living memory, erased from official lists, swallowed by the silence of the earth. But in the dark, close air of KV-62, linen-wrapped gold, wood, stone, and flesh waited patiently. The boy king lying as his embalmers had left him, arms crossed, mask gleaming in the dark, surrounded by a lifetime compressed into 4 small rooms. For centuries Tutankhamun slept in his cramped little tomb, while the world above changed beyond anything his embalmers could have imagined. New dynasties rose and fell. The Greeks came with Alexander, the Romans followed, then Byzantines, then Arabs, Ottomans, Europeans, and the language of Egypt shifted. The gods' names faded into stories, and the Valley of the Kings slowly became for most people just another barren fold of desert rock. In November 1922, after years of searching with Lord Carnarvon's support, Englishman Howard Carter found a rock-cut step in the Valley of the Kings. Following the steps led to a sealed doorway bearing the necropolis seals and the faint name Tutankhamun. Peering through a small hole, Carter famously whispered to Carnarvon, "Yes, wonderful things," as the room beyond was filled with untouched gold, statues, furniture, and chariots, gleaming in the candlelight. Tombs were found and robbed, some in ancient times, some by early explorers and treasure hunters. Great stone sarcophagi were pried open, mummies unwrapped, gold stripped away. The once hidden entrances of many royal tombs lay exposed, their contents long vanished into private collections or melted down for their metal. And yet, under rubble and workmen's huts, Beneath a patch of ground that has been trampled and ignored, Tutankhamun's little tomb remained almost completely sealed. By the early 20th century, archaeologists had come to believe that the Valley of the Kings had given up nearly all its secrets. Many thought nothing truly new remained to be found. But one man, Howard Carter, was not convinced. Working with the backing of Lord Carnarvon, he spent season after season in the heat and dust, carefully clearing debris, mapping every scrap of pottery and wall fragment, convinced that somewhere one royal burial was still waiting. Year after year, funds dwindled and patience wore thin. He found bits and pieces, workers' huts, fragments of objects, traces of old ramps. Promising areas turned out to be nothing. To many, it must have seemed that he was simply moving sand for the sake of it, chasing a dream the valley had no intention of granting. Then, in November of 1922, near the floor of the valley, close to the tomb of Ramesses VI, his team uncovered the top of a cut step. One step led to another, then another, a staircase descending into the ground. At the bottom, they reached a sealed doorway, plastered and stamped with stamps bearing the necropolis seal and Tutankhamun's name. Some marks suggested that the tomb had been broken into and resealed in antiquity, but the seals were still largely intact. Carter understood immediately what he might have found. A royal tomb. A name almost erased from history. An entrance that had remained hidden beneath later structures and debris. He sent a famous telegram to Carnarvon. At last have made wonderful discovery in valley. A magnificent tomb with seals intact. Recovered same for your arrival. A few weeks later, the two men stood together at the doorway at the bottom of the stair. Carter made a small hole in the sealed plaster, lit a candle and peered inside. Behind him, Carnarvon asked, "Can you see anything?" Carter, eyes slowly adjusting to the flickering light, saw shapes, colours, gleam upon gleam. He answered with words that would become legend. Yes, wonderful things. What he saw was the antechamber, crammed from floor to ceiling with the compressed remains of a royal life. There were chariots, their wheels and bodies gilded and inlaid, leaning at strange angles as if frozen mid-tumble. There were beds shaped like lions and cows, couches with elegant legs, chairs with arms carved into animal forms. There were gilded boxes and chests stacked in haphazard towers. Ebony and ivory inlays winked in the lamplight. Linen bundles, once white, now dulled by age, lay in heaps and stacks. Statues of the king stood in guard-like poses, black against the gleam of gold. The room looked oddly chaotic, nothing like the orderly museum displays we're used to now. Objects brushed against each other, overlapped, leaned, and balanced in precarious nests. For Carter it was like stepping into a storeroom hastily packed, and then locked for the night, except that the night had lasted for more than 3,000 years. This very chaos was one of the first clues to the haste with which Tutankhamun had been buried. In a more leisurely royal funeral, objects would have been arranged with greater care. Furniture spaced out, chests aligned, statues placed in formal groups. Here, though, it seemed as though time had run out and the packers had simply filled every available corner, pushing and stacking until the door could just barely be sealed. Beyond the antechamber, further discoveries waited. After weeks of careful documentation, photographs, notes, sketches, Carter's team made its way through a small doorway into the burial chamber. There, under a ceiling decorated with golden stars on a deep blue background, stood a large stone sarcophagus, its corners guarded by carved protective goddesses. Around it loomed huge gilded shrines, nested one inside another, pressing almost flush against the painted walls. Those walls bore scenes of Tutankhamun's transition from the world of the living to the realm of the gods. The art was beautiful, but simpler and more limited in scope than in many other royal tombs. Another sign of the compressed time in which it had been created. Rather than endless corridors covered in intricate multi-chapter texts of the underworld, this small chamber held a carefully chosen, condensed set of images and spells. When the shrines were dismantled and the stone sarcophagus lid raised, another miracle of layering appeared. 3 anthropoid coffins nested inside each other like shells. The innermost, astonishingly, was made of solid gold, its surface hammered and inlaid with glass and semi-precious stones, its features showing the smooth, idealized face of the king. Inside that golden shell lay Tutankhamun himself. His mummy was tightly wrapped, adorned with amulets, and over his face the famous golden mask, a masterpiece of craft that fused king and god into a single timeless image. Around him, in the treasury, in the annex, in the antechamber, every kind of object existed in miniature or full size, ready to serve him in the afterlife. Sandals, clothing, hunting gear, cosmetics, writing tools, games, jewellery and food. Yet as Carter and later scholars examined the tomb's contents more closely, they realised that the story they told was not just of wealth and artistry, but of hurry and adaptation. Many items clearly showed signs of reuse. The magnificent outer coffins and some of the jewellery bore traces that their original inscriptions had been altered. Feminine grammatical endings in certain spells suggested that a coffin or piece of equipment had first been intended for a woman, perhaps a royal lady or even a queen, before being reassigned to Tutankhamun. Cartouches with earlier names had been recarved or covered with gold foil bearing his. Some design elements belonged stylistically to the Amarna period, while others fit more comfortably into the traditional post-Amarna restoration style. It was as if craftsmen had raided whatever storerooms they could find, pulling out appropriate objects from different phases of recent history and reworking them just enough to make them seem as though they were made directly for the boy king. Even the size of the tomb, its curtailed plan and hastily finished decoration, whispered of a burial prepared under pressure. Rather than carving a long, multi-chambered monument, workers had taken a smaller tomb, perhaps originally cut for a non-royal, and transformed it as best they could into a suitable resting place for a pharaoh, racing to complete critical elements before the 70 days of mummification elapsed. Ancient hands, rushing under torchlight, had managed to do just enough. Modern technology, working in the electric gleam of labs and scanning machines, has continued to draw secrets from the tomb long after Carter's team finished their excavation. CT scans of the mummy have clarified old mysteries and raised new questions. Early theories of a dramatic blow to the head as cause of death have been largely set aside. The damage appears more consistent with post-mortem handling and ancient embalmers' work. Evidence of a broken leg, chronic health issues and malaria parasites has instead painted a picture of a physically fragile young man whose death may have been the result of a tragic combination of injury and disease rather than murder. Detailed study of the tomb's layout and contents has shown how much of Tutankhamun's life and times can be read between the lines of this hurried burial. We see the traces of the Amarna revolution in repurposed objects and artistic styles. We see the restoration of traditional gods in the iconography of coffins, shrines and wall scenes. We see the priorities of those who buried him, ensuring his proper ritual passage, legitimizing the new regime that followed, and doing both under the constraints of time and incomplete preparation. What makes Tutankhamun's tomb unlike any other is that all of these layers survived together, untouched by large-scale robbery, preserved in the exact, slightly chaotic arrangement created by those anxious, ancient hands. When you picture the tomb now, don't imagine the neat glass cases of a museum. Imagine instead a dim, close space packed to the ceiling with the compressed residue of a life. Chariots and beds, boxes and statues, jewellery and jars, all crowded around a single stone sarcophagus and the small golden-wrapped figure inside. It is the physical echo of that hurried time after his death, a moment when grief, political necessity and religious obligation collided, and the solution was to work as fast and as carefully as humanly possible. Carter's wonderful things were not just treasures, they were the frozen evidence of a rushed farewell, a farewell that, by sheer accident of circumstances, weathered 3 millennia almost intact so that the world could one day walk, step by careful step, into that little tomb and meet the boy king whose short life and hurried burial have become the brightest window into the dark, glittering world of ancient Egypt. When the last stone was set in Tutankhamun's doorway, and the valley winds began to erase the footprints of his funeral, no one standing there could have guessed that this young king, tucked into a borrowed, cramped tomb, would one day become the most famous pharaoh in the world. In ancient Egypt, his memory did not loom large. Later rulers, wanting to forget the Amarna upheaval, quietly smoothed over that whole chapter of history. King lists skip from earlier, greater names to later, more powerful ones. Tutankhamun's reign was short, his military achievements small, his building projects modest. For scribes crafting a clean story of the dynasty, he was easy to fold into the shadows. But stone and gold have their own stubborn way of remembering. Because his tomb was small, because it was reused, because it was buried beneath debris and overlooked by thieves, the record of his life remained intact in a way no grander pharaohs ever did. Kings who ruled for decades, who raised towering monuments and led glittering campaigns, had their tombs plundered again and again. Tutankhamun, the boy in the borrowed grave, kept his world tucked safely away until the 20th century. When Carter's candlelight first brushed those wonderful things, the forgotten king abruptly stepped into the global spotlight. Photographs of the golden mask, the nested coffins, and the chariots raced around the world. Newspaper headlines spoke of a pharaoh whose name most people had never heard before. Museums filled with visitors eager to see even a few of the objects from his tomb. Exhibitions travelled from continent to continent, and everywhere crowds formed long lines, willing to wait hours just to stand for a few moments in front of the mask. Tutankhamun, who in life ruled a land he may never have seen in full, became in death a citizen of the planet. For many, he became the face of ancient Egypt itself. When people thought of pharaohs, they no longer pictured only the massive weathered statues on temple facades or the distant impassive sphinx. They thought of a young face in gold, heavy-lidded eyes outlined in blue, a calm expression that seemed to look back at them from 3,000 years away. Yet his legacy is more than an image. The almost untouched state of his tomb changed how we understand Egyptian history. It gave archaeologists a complete, richly detailed snapshot of royal life, the design of garments, the style of beds, the games kings played, the food they ate, the tools they carried, and the gods they called upon. It revealed, in object after object, the subtle blending of Amarna's artistic experiments with the restored traditional forms. It showed us, in the reuse of certain pieces, how hurried and practical royal funerals could be, even under a veneer of perfection. It also forced difficult questions. Where should these objects live? In the country that made them, whose soil preserved them, whose people carry the legacy of ancient Egypt in their identity, or in museums abroad, where millions first encountered them and where they helped build the entire field of Egyptology. Debates about ownership, repatriation, and the ethics of excavation, all sharpened in the bright reflection of Tutankhamun's treasure. Over time, Egypt moved to reclaim not only the physical artifacts but the story itself. New museums were built or expanded. The boy king became part of national pride, his mask and name emblazoned on posters, books, and monuments. Conservators worked carefully to stabilize delicate objects, to protect them from light, humidity, and the slow damage of human breath and curiosity. The more we learned, the more we understood how fragile these eternal treasures really are. Modern scans and studies also narrowed the gap between the image and the person. Under the golden mask, we found not a myth, but a body. A young man with flaws, vulnerabilities, and a finite number of breaths. The evidence of illness, injury, and genetic strain reminds us that even those wrapped in gold cannot escape the simple, universal truth of being human. Tutankhamun's story, for all its glitter, is still a story of a short life lived under pressure, ending suddenly and laid to rest by grieving hands doing the best they could with the time and tools they had. In that sense, his legacy is strangely gentle. He shows us how history is shaped not only by grand plans, but by accidents and oversights. A too small tomb, a hurried burial, a patch of ground that no one bothered to quarry too deeply. These details, more than any conscious choice, preserved him. The king who was almost erased became unforgettable not because of what he did in life, but because of the way he was buried and forgotten. And yet, in being remembered, he gives something back. He bridges a vast distance. He lets us stand in a small painted room and feel, for a moment, that the ancient world is not so far away, that its fears, hopes, and efforts to care for the dead are not entirely unlike our own. Now, as our journey with Tutankhamun comes to an end, you can let the Valley of the Kings settle into silence again. The tourists have gone, the museum lights are dimmed, but in your mind the little tomb is still there. A narrow staircase, a small door, 4 crowded rooms, and at the centre of it all a boy wrapped in gold, finally at rest after 3,000 years of waiting in darkness. His life was brief, his burial was hurried, but across the gulfs of time and sand his story reached you tonight, and as you drift towards sleep you can let the image of that quiet chamber soften and fade like torchlight sinking into darkness. The king sleeps, the valley is still, and you too can let your thoughts lie down beside him, resting in the deep, calm hush of history and night. If these whispered histories have soothed your spirit, others searching for rest might find their way here too through a quiet like or subscription. But for now, until the next legend calls to you from the mists of time, may your slumber be deep and your dreams be magnificent. Sleep well.